Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Mark Oppenheimer. I direct the Yale Journalism Initiative and write for the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine.
Let's start with your tablet piece on an Episcopal chaplain at Yale. Why don't you introduce the story and then we can talk about it?
Sure. Yes, I should also add that I'm an editor at large for Tablet, which is at tabletmag.com. I call it the universe's leading source for Jewish news, arts, and so forth. The Episcopal chaplain at Yale College sent a letter to the New York Times in late August in response to an op-ed that had run about rising anti-Semitism in Europe. And his letter said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but his letter said, basically, if people who are worried about anti-Semitism should encourage Israel's patrons abroad, I think was his term, to tell Netanyahu to find a peaceful solution to the Gaza conflict. This caused a big uproar because the op-ed that he was responding to had, it talked about innocent Jews and Israelis being murdered in Brussels, among other places. I mean, people who had nothing specifically to do with the war in Gaza. And his response in his letter was seeming to, if not exonerate the culprits, say, well, the real problem is Netanyahu and is Israel.
Right.
And it seemed to take the blame off of anti-Semites. And he came under a lot of attack. And ultimately, in early September, he resigned from his job as the Episcopal chaplain to Yale students. And I interviewed him for Tablet just to sort of draw out his own thinking and to kind of try to help understand, rather than just throw him under the bus and say this guy's obviously an anti-Semite, to try to understand where he was coming from. It didn't seem that in the media he'd been given a chance to explain himself.
Sure, yeah. And so what did were you surprised about what you found after doing that extra reporting?
Well, so a lot of people I got a tremendous reaction to the piece. And a lot of people felt it was that what he said was further evidence that he was obviously some sort of total anti-Semite. I didn't see it quite that way. What I confronted him with was the analogy that if, after 9/11, would you say in response to episodes in the United States of anti-Muslim violence, of which there were several, mm-hmm. Well, look, don't blame the Americans, blame Al-Qaeda. That's not the way we respond to bigotry.
Right.
In an enlightened society. We respond by attacking the bigots.
Right.
He seemed to take that point. I mean, I think he was receptive to that point. I think that ultimately he, he's someone who grew up in Egypt. I think that he said as much, that his sympathies, his heart tends to go out to Arabs, mm-hmm. and people should go read the interview and see what he said in his own words. But I think it was just, I don't feel that he entirely crosses the empathetic bridge to understanding why what he said was so problematic for Jews. Now, what was very interesting about the interview was that some websites, like Philip Weiss's website, Mondo Weiss, which is an anti-Zionist website, had presumed that Jewish donor pressure had somehow driven him out of Yale. And Bruce Shipman himself, Father Shipman, did not seem to think that was the case. He put the blame squarely on his own bishop, on the Episcopal bishop of the Diocese of Connecticut, mm-hmm. who basically told him you have to resign. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that what would have been interesting is if his own bishop had stood by him. I think he could have weathered this. And I should say, personally, I'm not in favor of scalping people. I'm not in favor of always looking for a resignation when somebody says something wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's much more useful to keep people in a community and hope to educate them and bring them into dialogue and build friendship. So I was not. I was saddened when the result was that he resigned, and I don't think it's good for the Jewish community for there even to be a perception that when people cross it, what they will then do, or what their well-meaning Gentile allies will do, is to exact a resignation from someone, is to take away someone's livelihood. I don't think that's a good way of doing things.
Yeah, I tend to agree on that general point. I remember thinking this back during the whole Rush Limbaugh, Sandra Fluke imbroglio. Right. Of course, Rush Limbaugh didn't resign from radio or anything like that. But it was one of those forced apology kind of situations, right?
Right.
And there were calls for his resignation. And what I always want, instead of calls for resignation, I wish the thing that you had to do if you say one of these things that are widely regarded as offensive, I wish the thing people were forced to do wasn't resign, but to like either, but to defend themselves, like to appear in a debate and either defend themselves or be excoriated,
right.
accept the excoriation, but somehow to be publicly accountable to this idea and to think through either why they think it's wrong or why they stand by it. And it seems like that would be, it seems like that would serve a kind of teaching function, because typically lots of other people hold these beliefs and are only and only get conspiracy minded when they think that they're being suppressed as opposed to definitively disproved.
No, I think that's right. And I absolutely thought that the first thing that should have happened was that everyone who disagreed with Father Shipman should have invited him to lunch or dinner. And, there is one rabbi on the Yale campus, Shmuley Hecht, Hecht, who's someone I'm friendly with and have known for many years, who's a Lubavitcher Hasidic rabbi, who did invite Shipman to dinner with a number of professors and students. And apparently they went for 4 or 5 hours and had a really fruitful exchange. That's not something that the Yale campus rabbi, the official Hillel rabbi, did. And I think it's something that that the Episcopal bishop should have tried to set up. I think it's something that the Yale rabbi should have tried to set up. I think there should always be just sort of radical calls for conversation, And I feel the same way when Ahmadinejad is speaking at, Columbia University, which is he should have to go eat dinner, with the Jewish students at Hillel, and then go eat at the St. Thomas More House with Catholics, and then go eat with the atheist students, and then he should have to go eat with the gay students.
Right.
And but people are allowed to kind of dip in, say what they want, and then resign,
right,
and never have to actually have conversations.
Yeah. Well, so what about this larger issue? You see this on you see controversies like this come up, not only with the Israel-Palestine conflict, but they do happen on both sides of that conflict, where someone says either exactly what this Episcopal chaplain said or something similar, or on the other hand, the kind of Fox News version of this is, well, these, this Palestinian child was killed, and this wouldn't happen if, the adults in the Gaza Strip hadn't elected Hamas, or if whatever, if Palestinians as a group hadn't done this thing. And it kind of, I think, you can think of a dozen similar or like controversies with groups, and you used some in your analogies, like some people will say, well, this innocent African American wouldn't have been pulled over and harassed wrongfully by the police if not for other black people committing crimes, right? It's this same mentality. And so what I wonder is, we can all agree in the African American example that I just gave that that's obviously and clearly wrong. And I agree that the example of this Yale Episcopal chaplain is wrong. Is there a thornier issue anywhere? I'm trying to think this through when it comes to Israel and Judaism, where obviously not all Jews think of themselves as Zionists or particularly agree with Israel. On the other hand, there's this subset of people who have both Jewish ethnic identity and allegiance to the Jewish state, even though they don't happen to live in it. Do you think that these kind of overlapping, confusing issues are part of why you have people saying offensive things like this, or is it just a subset of this larger attitude that maps onto other groups perfectly?
Well, I mean, sure, it's obviously part of why some people say things like this, and they can always point to people who work for Zionist organizations in the United States who want it to be believed that Judaism and Zionism are coextensive.
Right.
I mean, that is a lie in which both hardcore Zionist ideologues and polemicists and propagandists and anti-Semites collude.
Right.
And of course, the victims here are all people who cherish any sort of nuance and all people who cherish the truth, which is that, no two identities are perfectly coextensive or coterminous, right? That there are people for whom being a woman and being a progressive, or being a woman and being a feminist, or being an African American and a and a progressive, or being a Southerner and being an evangelical. There are people who have identities that seem to map pretty closely onto each other and that function in their lives in very similar ways. But of course, they can always be teased apart. They're never identical. And it's the job of thoughtful people to resist that kind of easy naming or identification. So you hope better of the Episcopal chaplain to students at Yale, but it's a very human instinct to. We all work on inferences and oversimplifications and generalizations. And look, there are plenty of Jews for whom their Judaism is unthinkable without Zionism, and in fact, there are plenty of Jews for whom Zionism has actually become the only substance of their Judaism, right? So one of the things that's happened in post-war America, you could say the post-war West, but I'll speak about post-war America, is for lots of Jews who have no particular interest in Jewish religion, theology, Jewish scripture, Jewish ethics, Jewish history, any of it, but want to retain some sort of ethnic identification, it all became Zionism. It just became a kind of jingoistic support for the Israeli nation state. Mm-hmm. That has not been good for Judaism, right? That's been terrible for Judaism and for the practice of Judaism, because it allows a lot of people to feel like, well, I gave at the office. The fact that I don't actually know what the Ten Commandments are, right? Or the fact that I don't understand my own holidays, the fact that I don't understand my own religious scripture or texts, but all of which, by the way, are perfectly excusable. I don't think there's any moral or ethical failing in being indifferent to one's ancestral religion.
Right. Yeah.
It's just that if what you care about is the continuity of that religion, then the fact that some people feel that they've done all that they have to do by just kind of rooting for a particular country is bad for the continuity of that religion.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's while we're on this subject, let's talk about this other tablet piece. Let's see, what was it about? It was a reporter who had covered political unrest. I'm not sure if it was a number of different conflicts over many years, but
it was. So it's Matty Friedman, who was for many years in the Associated Press Jerusalem bureau and lives in Israel and covered Israel for I want to say about a decade or so.
And this piece, I really enjoyed reading it because it seemed to me one of the best versions I've ever read of a certain perspective. That perspective being that there is kind of a pervasive media bias against Israel in its various geopolitical conflicts, and of course there's this furious debate. There are other people who would furiously argue that there's pervasive media bias that is pro-Israel, right, and that is anti-Palestine, and so if one is trying to wrap their minds around this debate, I think that this is perhaps the best piece I've ever seen from the side that's arguing that there is this bias against Israel. And he kind of runs through the number of deaths there have been in conflicts between Israel and Palestine, and basically points out that you could look at lots of other conflicts all over the world where lots more people are dying, where there are also kind of clear malactors deliberately killing people. And yet the Israel-Palestine conflict gets much more press attention.
Right. In fact, some of these conflicts, like in the Congo, or currently in Syria, you can go to the piece to make sure that I'm getting this right. Some of them, more people have died in the past several years than in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict over a century.
Right. And so this question arises, why is there obsessive attention on the Israel-Palestine conflict? And he argues, and it's been a little bit since I've read this piece, but he argues that anti-Semitism helps to explain this, and that political and ideological bias help to explain this. And so what I found really interesting about the piece is when I look at what I agree is this obsession with the Israel-Palestine conflict, as far as where journalistic resources are put, compared to the number of, if we were measuring like the number of deaths in the world.
Right.
And arguably even, this is harder to tease out, but like what geopolitical conflict is most important in terms of its future impact on the world or the United States. It isn't clear to me that it's the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
It could totally be somewhere else. So why are all the resources pouring in here? I don't want to discount the presence of anti-Semitism, which certainly exists both in the United States and Europe. At the same time, I think that pro-Israel sentiment is as much explains this as much as anti-Israel sentiment, which is to say, there are a lot of people in the United States, both Jews who identify with Israel, as well as Christians who are heavily invested in the success of Israel, and their interest in the country and the conflict is surely a lot of what's driving media attention. And then I think the second piece of it that I don't think that this title piece really acknowledges is the degree to which Israel is held to a higher standard, and this is one of the complaints that the piece makes, in a way that I think is defensible and makes sense, in the same way that the United States is held to a higher standard, in the same way that France is held to a higher standard. If tomorrow in Paris,
let's stop there for a second. I think we agree on that, by the way. Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with your analysis. I like the fact that you're pointing out, and I would go even farther and be more specific and talk about, that the evangelical Christian Zionist presence in the United States is, numerically speaking anyway, and potentially, financially speaking, as important or more important, it's more important numerically than any Jewish presence. I mean, you have millions and millions and millions of evangelical Zionists. And when you talk about red state support, red state congressmen and their support for Israel, it is clearly the case that for many or most of them, the votes that are at stake, I mean, yes, there are dollars, but a lot of these people are in very safe seats. And the votes that are at stake are not Jewish votes. Some of these people have no Jewish voters to speak of in their district. The votes that are at stake are evangelical Christian votes, for whom, Zionism has theological meaning. And in fact, for some of whom it has theological meaning that far outstrips any meaning it holds for relatively assimilated or secular Jews. So that's an enormous piece of it, right? Is this kind of philo-Semitism of the American Christian right. Mm-hmm. And then of course the Zionism of many American Jews, and the reflexive knee-jerk Zionism of many Americans for a long-term ally, especially an ally who seems to be standing against powers that they perceive to be Arab and Islamic, and that they easily sloppily slot into the category of people who did 9/11. Right. So it's perfectly understandable in all sorts of ways. I do think that let's see, what was it you said that I stopped you on that I wanted to go farther on?
Well, I guess what I started to talk about is the idea of
the higher standard.
To what standard ought people
say more about this. I mean, say more about that.
Okay,
like,
sure.
Why? I mean, I think you're right that Israel's held to a higher standard than, say, North Korea,
right,
which, of course, is a far worse regime than just about anything.
Right. I think.
But why?
So I think that it's partly a matter of news. That news is stuff that happens that is less expected, right? Not stuff that is always happening.
Right. A lot of the worst countries in the world are pretty static.
Right. And we. And it's not as if North Korea isn't covered because people think it's insufficiently awful to cover, or that people are making a judgment that the places they are covering are worse. It's that there's pretty broad agreement and an assumption that North Korea is, one of the worst, if not the worst regime on earth. And right, everyone condemns it. And there's nothing really that anyone sees to be done about it. And so, what am I going to do? Write a piece about the latest outrage in North Korea and how terrible, like what, how many times can you do that?
Right.
So I think that's part of the double standard, is that Israel is a democratic country that purports to have liberal values and does in fact have liberal values and can be can be subject to persuasion, right? Can be subject to shaming, right. Can be, and the same, and this,
it can be, right. Like South Africa 20 years ago
exactly.
or 30 years ago, it can be shamed.
Yeah. And this same logic applies, to, I almost never write about, Israel and Palestine just because it's a subject that I haven't had time to wrap my mind around particularly. And it requires such an upfront investment to talk about it conversantly enough to get past the, you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
But, I write critically about the United States all the time. This isn't because I think that the United States is more malign than other countries. It's because I am invested in this because I have a stake in it. But both because I feel like my voice can influence the policies of the United States or public opinion in a way that will ultimately have an effect on policy, and also because I'm complicit in it. And this is kind of the last piece in the American media, that there's this relationship between the United States that's a close alliance, and it involves a lot of military funding. And I think this doesn't quite go quite as far as some critics of Israel think, because the United States, of course, supplies money and weapons to a lot of different countries that do a lot of terrible things that don't get as much attention as Israel. But I do think that this is an important piece of the double standard that American taxpayers, or some American taxpayers anyway, feel somewhat complicit in Israeli foreign policy because it is being underwritten and would be impossible without the United States.
How many Americans do you think know that, or have any sense, if you ask them how many billions of dollars do we give to Israel, that they'd come within, 10 billion of the right answer?
Oh, who knows what the knowledge level is of the typical American citizen that you would meet on the street. But I think among people writing about this online and in the media, I think most people know that the United States is the biggest donor country to Israel and supplies it with weapons and this kind of thing. And you have to, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think so. I think we're largely in agreement, right? I don't actually agree with the last piece of that, the sense that, well, we're part of the outrage is that we're complicit in it. So here's my thought experiment, right?
Yeah.
If our $3 billion in foreign aid every year went away, would the interest in Israel and its sins, which are many, abate among its critics in America? I don't think so. I don't think in any meaningful way. They'd say, okay, well, we're not as complicit. Now they're sort of more like, it's hard to even say, right? We give aid to so many places.
Right, yeah.
I was going to say Saudi, but
right.
That doesn't work, right? But I don't think they would say, okay, well, now our hands are clean. We're not giving them as much aid, or we're not giving them aid anymore. I don't think that has the first thing to do with it. I don't think that's where I don't think that moral outrage tends to be generated in that particular way by American citizens, as some sort of analysis of, well, whom are we sheltering with our dollars or our missiles or whatever. It's possible. Certainly those people exist, right?
Yeah. I almost agree with you.
But I don't think that's many people. Rather,
but is it many bureau chiefs, right? Is it many editors?
No, I don't think so. It's possible, right? That just my read of what motivates people, including the subset of people, the subspecies we call journalists,
right, yeah.
is not that they some sort of cool or even visceral appraisal of where our foreign dollars go.
Yeah.
I think that, there's two separate questions. What motivates American critics of Israel, and what motivates journalistic attention to Israel?
Right, yeah.
What motivates American critics is a whole bunch of things, including, we should say upfront, genuine and authentic moral outrage at some of the crimes committed by Israel, by the Israeli nation state,
yeah.
which commits crimes as many nation states do, especially ones that are at war, and should be held, at least as accountable as other countries, mm-hmm. and has vastly more firepower than the people in Gaza and West Bank,
right.
who often bear the brunt of it, right? So the genuine moral outrage is one. Some of it on the part of American citizens may be the sense that, well, we give them dollars. Mm-hmm. Some of it is anti-Semitism, is a sense of like, let's stick it to the Jews, or a relief that, well, when you point out the Jews are doing bad things, it's sort of exculpatory for everyone else. If the greatest victims in the world can do these bad things, can turn on you and be immoral, well, then we can let ourselves off the hook for a lot.
Right.
Right. The last thing I would say on the part of most Americans who pay attention to this, is I think it's racism, because it's the Middle Eastern conflict looks like white people killing.
I think that's true.
Fairly white people, like slightly darker, but basically still very white people. And so the number of reasons they care about that and nothing in Africa is that this looks like Ireland to them, or France or other places where white people have been killed.
Well, I don't know. I would say I think that Israel looks like that to them. I don't think that Palestine looks like that to them. I think that and this is obviously this is a kind of crude summary of it, but I think that there's substantial on one side anti-Muslim racism that plays into this, and that makes it very easy for people to kind of otherize Palestine and sometimes speak in language that is subhuman. Of course, there's the anti-Semitic equivalent to that goes on. But then there's also on the left, there's also this way in which the relationship between Israel and Palestine is kind of a stand-in for their ideas about colonialism and race as it applies to colonialism. And so it really, this conflict really maps into the larger concerns and narratives of both sides in a way that I think generates attention.
That's a more precise way to put it, which is at this point, what's going on in Africa or in Syria strikes many Americans as brown people killing brown people. Uh-huh. And that has less moral purchase on them. It's less interesting to them than a situation which they can perceive one of the groups as a stand-in for whites. All of this, of course, is nonsensical in the way that most racialist discussion is nonsensical. Uh-huh. But you're right that's another reason. Now, but look, I want to get back. I mean, I think that Monty Friedman's piece had some problems, and I should say that I okayed its publication when I was standing in for someone on maternity leave at Tablet this summer. I didn't edit it, but I signed off on it. Mm-hmm. So just full disclosure. I think it has some problems. What I think is really astonishing, though, that we all have to reckon with is, when he talks about how the AP has something like 40 people in, Jerusalem or within an hour or two of Jerusalem, and something like, one person in Central Africa.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it's just there's no way to justify the extraordinary gravity of the discrepancy between how intensely covered this conflict is and how undercovered other far deadlier, far more painful conflicts are. That's not just about Israel and anti-Semitism. It's also just about indifference to the suffering of people who don't look like us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really know how I would. I can think of lots of stories that I think have been overcovered in the history of journalism because I don't think that they're important at all. I think that what's going on in Israel and Palestine is fraught and serious enough, and there are enough terrible things that happen that I can't imagine saying, "Oh, this is overcovered." But I can certainly look at the other discrepancies he points out and say, "Wow, vast swaths of the earth are undercovered in a way that I agree is indefensible." And like I said, despite my disagreements with the author, I think that he lays out his perspective as powerfully as I've ever seen it done, and it's one that's widely shared. So I really appreciated the piece.
But I don't want to let go. Just before we leave this, I don't want to let go of an important point that I think is motivating him, and that comes out of this piece, which is that Jews are very cognizant of the fact that for many, many people in this world, the first place to look whenever they feel discomfited or troubled or oppressed or unemployed is to focus on Jews. That a sort of a disproportionate gaze toward Jews is very often a precursor to or a warning flag for really, really lethal anti-Semitism. An economy crashes, so you say, well, let's look at the Jewish bankers. Or, Germany fails in wars, you say, well, the Jews sabotaged us on the front. Or, it's not when Jews talk about anyone focusing too much on them, it's not just a discussion about, well, where should the media allocate its resources, right? Lying behind it is the fact that there are lots of people for whom an obsessive and unitary focus on Jews is exactly what their anti-Semitism is about. Mm-hmm. And so you can see how to someone who's living in Israel, again, a country about the size of New Jersey with not that many people, relatively rich, but not one of the great 5 or 6, powers, in terms of wealth, why they would say, how is it that when there's a few hundred deaths in a conflict that we're involved in, the entire world cares? And meanwhile, tens of thousands of people are dying daily in other conflicts and nobody cares. That's.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I agree that that's an important part of the piece. And I think that there's truth in it. I guess if I were arguing with the author, what I'd say now is that I think he too easily conflates all of the attention given to Israel, all of those 40 AP people say, with that narrative, when in fact, I think there's these two things going on, right? There's Jews as an embattled minority in the world at large, and that's an important dynamic to understand. And then there's this smaller conflict between Palestine and Israel, where Israel is the more powerful party, and holding these two ideas in mind at the same time are difficult for some people. But then I think a lot of the coverage of the conflict, right, the disproportionate coverage is in part precisely motivated by a desire on the part of Americans, on the part of people in the media, a concern with Jews as an embattled minority. In other words, a Jewish death within Israel makes far more headlines than a death, even one caused by Israel in Palestine, right?
Right, but part of the hope, and I'm speaking. I'm now creating a straw man and allowing him to speak, right?
No, but
part of the hope of someone like Monty Friedman, I would think. Let me put words in his mouth.
Yeah.
Is that would not be the case either, right? You can go back to Herzl and say one big piece of the Zionist dream is like, this is the place where we can go be obscure and normal.
Right.
Right. So I could totally see Monty Friedman saying, you're right. Like, that's effed up also. A Jewish death in Israel shouldn't matter any more than anyone's, and a Palestinian death shouldn't matter any more than they matter tremendously.
Right.
And therefore there's something pathological and sick whenever any media narrative begins to overvalue them in some extraordinarily lopsided way.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's this really, I think when we talk about how much attention is put on this conflict, it's very hard to tease out how much of it is as a result of a special concern with making sure that Israel is not overrun by foreign enemies, that Israel continues to exist as a state, right, that we don't really feel about other states. And so we put a lot of attention onto this one. And on the other hand, the kind of anti-Semitic reflex that you're talking about. Both of these things, right, the reaction you would in some ways want the world to have to Jews under threat, to Israel under threat, and the reaction you would not want them to have, the anti-Semitic, we're going to focus disproportionately on Jews, they both militate toward the same thing, which is more coverage of this conflict.
No, I think that's right. Let me just say, by the way, that you, of course, have written so much and so eloquently about the American secret security state and drone warfare and stuff like that. And so, just to go to your point about to the extent that any of this concern is motivated by the sense that we're implicated in it, one way to realize how I think hollow that must be is to say that, of course, we're all deeply implicated in the murder of innocent people by drones in Afghanistan.
Right.
Some not innocent people, but lots of collateral innocent people. And as you know, basically nobody cares.
Right. Yeah.
And we're really, really implicated in that. I mean, that is our president ordering these.
Yeah.
And nobody cares at all. So again, it's so why people care about these things is so psychologically deep, and it's not crazy to sort of poke around for what the psychological impulses behind it are.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, maybe this is a good time to jump to Laura Poitras and the Snowden leaks, since we started talking about the national security state. I just saw a screening of her documentary that is soon to be released about Edward Snowden and the surveillance state. It's quite well done. It's Frontline did a 2-part documentary about the Snowden leaks that is the best thing you will see if you were to watch one thing to kind of get an understanding of the different sorts of spying the United States government is doing, and the legal authorities they purport to be responsible or to justify these kinds of spying. I would watch that if that's what you want. The Poitras film is its subject is kind of a hybrid between, on one hand, it's about the surveillance state. That's definitely the subject. But she has this footage of Snowden right as he's doing this huge historical act. The way I put it in the review I wrote was basically, we don't know what the expression on Mark Felt's face was when he was talking to Woodward and Bernstein. We don't know what the timbre and the tone of Daniel Ellsberg's voice was, or the exact words he used when he handed over the Pentagon Papers. But we actually have a video camera in the room when Snowden met Greenwald and Poitras for the first time and sat in a Hong Kong hotel room and had this historically consequential leak. And I think this movie will be remembered as an artifact for that reason alone. Apart from that, it's a very interesting and well-done look at the surveillance state, but one that I think is best watched by someone who's at least been following the story and doesn't need like a whole primer on what it's about.
Right. I mean, do you think, has there been a good book about this yet?
About what?
About Snowden.
I mean,
or is it too soon?
Well, so Glenn Greenwald published his book about Snowden, and it's a kind of first person, like, I
guess that's right.
Here's what happened from the beginning. And, it's suspenseful and well done. And you get Greenwald's perspective and arguments, and you get Snowden, you get, his view on Snowden. And I have to say the Poitras movie, Greenwald portrays Snowden in a certain way in his book. And it's hard to know whether that is accurate or not, or whether it's just his impression. It's hard to know what you would think if you were actually there. Everything in the Poitras movie, to me, squares with Greenwald's description of Snowden. In other words, his kind of self-effacing manner, his desire not to be in the spotlight, and there was this whole counter-narrative put out by the U.S. government that Snowden is, a spotlight-hungry narcissist who is, radical. In all of that, Greenwald's description and Poitras' portrait agree with one another, which isn't to say that they're necessarily right, but it's to say I can see how Greenwald walked out of the meeting that he had, or the meetings that he had, and wrote exactly what he did, because it's exactly what I saw. And one interesting aspect of this is Poitras has these 10 hours of footage from Hong Kong that she suggested in one interview that she would release the raw footage.
That she'd release someday, right?
Yeah. And so I'd be fascinated to watch that. Because
I think I have felt personally completely captive to sort of competing narratives. And part of it is that my own experience when I've known whistleblowers is that they often are, necessary, but noxious and narcissistic people. And so I think for a lot of people, whenever you've had experience with people who manage to muster A, that level of courage, and B, that level of certainty that they're right to do something like that, they've tended to be people you don't want to spend much time with. And so I think that the government's counter narrative, which it seems to me they very deftly put out through all sorts of, conservative think tanks and op-ed people who just kind of almost in concert wrote exactly, who kind of wrote directly into my suspicions, there was fertile soil for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's always a problem. And the other problem, of course, with whistleblowers is that, they immediately make us feel slightly ashamed by our own recognition that we wouldn't have the courage to do what they've done, even if we thought it was the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah.
And so a lot of people are very prepared to want to think the worst of someone like Snowden, because otherwise we have to think the worst of ourselves. And I think the government knows that, and that's exactly where it's so the narrative is not he's mentally ill. The narrative is not, it's not even really so much that he's some sort of, deep cover, spy for, double agent or whatever, though there was some of that.
Yeah.
It's much more just that he's, a self-promoter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I'll be curious once. I'll be curious once this is released, whether whether the kind of public perception of Snowden changes.
Right.
Because
when is it going to be released?
I want to say, let's see, what's the date today? I want to say next Friday.
Next Friday. Oh.
It's going to come out next Friday.
Let me ask you something. That line when he says to her in the email, right, that, you know, if you want to do this, you should know that everything you say, every email, every phone call, every conversation is potentially going to be overheard by the government, right?
Yeah.
That they'll find you everywhere, that your entire life. Do you think that's true?
Yes. Well, in her case, I mean, so actually the context of that in the movie, I believe, and, you know, I only saw it once in the screening, so I could be remembering this wrong. But I'm pretty sure that when Snowden first contacted Poitras, right, he had tried to contact Greenwald first and wasn't able to get through to him because Greenwald got this email that said, you need to encrypt your email and talk to me. And he was like, I don't know who this person is, whatever.
Right.
So he reaches out to Poitras and they correspond for a while. And what he wrote to Poitras was, you know, something to the effect of, you asked why I chose you. I didn't. You chose yourself. And the line about all the surveillance you'd be subject to was a description of what was in fact already the case. In other words, the United States government had identified her as a person of interest, and you may have read the stories about how she would be stopped at the airport every time that she tried to go in and out of the country. And Snowden was saying that I'm pretty sure, I'm 75% sure. Snowden was saying that she was a selected person of interest, right, already, and that she was flagged in this way, and that subjected her to these various things. And yes, I absolutely believe, whether or not that I'm misinterpreting that, let's just talk about the idea of, if the NSA, if the federal government does designate you as a person of interest, can they really do all of that stuff? Absolutely. I mean, they can remotely activate the microphone on your cellular phone, for example. They can.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, and this is like something a lot of people don't know, but that, I've never been in a position where I've had a government whistleblower come to me and say, my career is at stake. Here's this terrible thing the government is doing. Protect me as a source. I've never had a source like that, right? But let's say that I did have a source like that, and I wanted to come to you for journalistic advice about like how I write this story, some question about it, right?
Right.
And if you and I were to meet and we were to go out to dinner, or we were to take a walk in a park, or we were to sit in a hotel room somewhere, I would take our cell phones and I would put them in a different room before I were to have that conversation. Because, like an iPhone, they can remotely activate the microphone on an iPhone when the phone appears to be off.
Is that with Apple's cooperation?
Yes, I believe. Well, I believe so. Certainly.
Dang.
Certainly, there's a lawful way to do this, where they could try and target someone and go and get a warrant and do this.
Right.
Do they have the technological capability to do it without Apple's cooperation? I'm a little bit unclear on that. I don't know.
Right.
Because there's so many details. This is part of what's driving press coverage of this story. I'm more and more convinced is like every time I read about this, I have like 50 tabs open on my computer, and I'm going back and double checking like 100 details that I knew 3 weeks ago and that I've forgotten now. And it's just tremendously complicated and hard to wrap your mind around. And I think that this is a little bit of why it's kind of faded from the headlines in some places, and some things that are like pretty important haven't gotten reported, and except very narrowly. And so I wonder what this movie is going to do to the kind of larger Snowden conversation.
Well, let's talk again after I've seen it.
Yeah, let's do that.
I would love that. I think that'd be really exciting for me.
So another thing that's kind of been in the news is it came out that they asked Jon Stewart if he would be interested in taking over to host Meet the Press. And this has occasioned a lot of debate about whether Jon Stewart is a good interviewer of people or a bad interviewer of people.
Right.
Did you have any thoughts?
I have not seen a full episode of Meet the Press ever. I should say.
Uh-huh.
I'm not even sure I've seen 20 minutes of an episode of Meet the Press in the past 20 years. I don't watch it. I don't watch any of those Sunday morning shows.
Yes.
It's not out of any personal, it's not out of any principle.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something I'm proud of or something that I'm not proud of.
Right, yeah.
It's just that I have other things to do with my time.
Yes.
And I certainly saw so many interviews with congressmen, senators, so-called dignitaries that were so fawning and didn't seem to ask the tough questions.
Right.
That I ceased to think of them as useful programs.
Yeah.
Now, I see a lot more Jon Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the bigger question here that this gets to is really, how much voice and how much personality and how much opinion do we allow our journalists for the mainstream media?
Mm-hmm.
And how skeptical and how snarky and how dubious and dubitable can they seem?
Uh-huh.
And, this is interesting. Just yesterday, I was reading a very good article in Nieman Reports put out by the Nieman Center at Harvard about the French media, where there isn't really a line between editorial and news at all. I mean, if a paper is to the left, then all of their news is skewed to the left. Right. And if it's to the right, and, that's not so far from the model at some English newspapers also. And America, of course, has this model that came about in, the early 20th century, I think, with the Times and other papers where the product that they started selling was neutrality. Mm-hmm. It used before that papers belonged to political parties, so you had the Tallahassee, Democrat and the Waterbury Republican and the Springfield Republican in Massachusetts and the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, right? They were party papers.
Yeah.
And then they're, I think probably driven by business models, by the need of capitalists for reliable news, so they could, assess business conditions and how to invest. They began asking they wanted newspapers that didn't belong to parties, that were just kind of give it to them more or less straight. But that's a historical accident. It's not by any means, normative for all time. And, in the current news climate, I actually think we need more. I would love to see the Sunday morning shows hosted by people who felt freer to just be openly skeptical, even if that got them pegged as being on one side or the other.
Yeah, you can go back and look. I definitely agree with you. I mean, Jay Rosen writes about this very well, what he calls the view from nowhere. And I do mm-hmm. think that the view from nowhere is a kind of, it's where any kind of probing questions or adversarial journalism goes to die. And you can go back and look at even William F. Buckley talking to Noam Chomsky on Firing Line. And you can see how that kind of exchange probes much deeper questions. But I think that there's something else going on here than personality, because, Bill O'Reilly interviewed Obama during the Super Bowl last year, and mm-hmm. he kind of, it was kind of play acting a tough interview. It was a faux tough interview. He came mm-hmm. with his kind of gruff, blustery Bill O'Reilly, whatever it is, and seemed to be very gruff with Obama and seemed to press him. The way that Bill O'Reilly will say, like, "Oh, you're spinning," or something like that.
Right.
That was his manner toward Obama, whatever the words were. But if you look at the substance of his questions, there was not a tough one in there. And to me, the interesting notion of Jon Stewart, I think the desire for Jon Stewart to take over this program, where it comes from, is this deeper way in which we allow our comedians to be adversarial toward mm-hmm. politicians, toward especially leading politicians, in a way that we don't allow our journalists to do.
Well, I would even turn that around and say that we expect of our journalists an enforced seriousness, a kind of which reduces to a kind of campy mock seriousness that precludes their asking certain kinds of tough questions or speaking certain truths. I mean, I'll give you an example. Are you old enough, Connor, to remember the time when David Brinkley said something very candid after a State of the Union address? I think it was maybe one of Clinton's early State of the Union addresses.
Okay.
And does this ring a bell at all?
No, I don't remember this.
And David Brinkley was getting up there in years. And I think it was Brinkley. We'll Google this. We'll discover I have every name in this wrong, but I think it was Brinkley. And, the address was over and they cut to the room where all the news anchor people and commentators, the color commentators, are going to tell you, was it a good speech or not? Mm-hmm. And the speech, of course, is always terrible. It's never actually good oration good oratory in any meaningful sense, right? It's always just a laundry list of things they promised to do in the next year. Right. Always terrible, right? On principle. In principle, it's terrible.
Yeah.
And Brinkley said something like, yeah, that was really, self-righteous regurgitated nonsense. I mean, he said something that was just utterly true. Yeah. Right? Yeah. A Kinsley gaffe, as Michael Kinsley says, a gaffe is when you accidentally tell the truth. Yeah. And then, Peter Jennings or whoever it was said, well, we all have different views of this. Let's cut to a commercial. And, of course, that's exactly what the commentator should be saying about the State of the Union every year, which is, first of all, the president didn't write it. It was written by a team of people. Right. It was vetted over and over again. There's no real oratory. All the applause is fake. All the non-applause, the people who stand are faking it. The people who choose to sit down are faking it. Right. And it's all just theater. But they don't say that. There's just a kind of candor because they are play acting their own role, which is this enforced seriousness. So sometimes it's that comedians get to do stuff that no one else gets to do. Sometimes just that comedians get to be normal people because they're not this species that we call the pundit or the news.
Right. We confuse seriousness and deference as if they're the same thing. And in fact, you can be very adversarial and very serious. But this is that combination is the mode we see. Let's jump to a last topic because I want to get in conversation of your excellent story for the New York Times Magazine. Is it out already? Is it coming out soon?
It's Sundays. It's on the web already, and it's in Sunday's Magazine.
So introduce it, and then we'll talk about it.
Sure. I visited Lakewood, New Jersey, which has one of the biggest concentrations of ultra-Orthodox or highly religious Orthodox Jews in the world. It's not far from the Jersey Shore, and it's grown enormously. It's like doubled in size since 1990 or something. Uh-huh. And it's about 90,000 people, about 50% of whom are exceedingly religious Jews. But what I focused on was the fact that because these Jews are commanded by Torah to give charity, and they tend to give to almost everyone who asks, the place has become a magnet for beggars, so that people fly in from all over the United States and from Israel, and they'll stay with relatives or they'll stay in a hostel for 3 weeks, and they'll just knock on doors every day, and they'll make thousands and thousands of dollars and then fly back to wherever they're from, having made a good chunk of change. So it's become this worldwide magnet for depending on how you look at it, either for begging or for charity. You could look at it positively and say it's one of the most charitable places in the world.
Yeah, and there's both. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's both intra-community charity, right, and these people traveling from places.
Right. So one of the things I was pleased to be able to get into the story was not only do you have the spectacle of people traveling from outside who knock on these doors. After having stopped at a beggar's office to get a permission slip.
That's one of the best details.
Right, having to establish their credentials, and they give a reference of a rabbi back home, and once they've checked out as being authentically needy and being a person of good character, they're given
a license to beg.
A permit to beg, right. So you have those people, but then also within the community, you have this enormous kind of shadow economy of charity. I mean, I don't have statistics on this, but there are probably more charitable nonprofits per capita than just about anywhere in the world. And
despite the fact that it's not a particularly wealthy community to begin with.
Not a wealthy community. Enormous amounts of the very limited resources in this community, where a lot of people have more children than I do, and certainly more than you do. a lot of the very limited resources get recycled into charity for people just below, your working class, and some of your money gets recycled to people who are truly poor, or you're poor and your money gets recycled to people who are desperately poor. Everyone keeps in their homes little cans where they put coins that they end up giving to local charity when the can is full. Every night there are dozens of dinners or salons in town which are fundraisers for this charity or that charity. And you can get anything you want in town for free. I mean, there are little storefront shops where if you need a china set because you just got married, they have free ones. If you need a wedding dress, they have free ones. If you need a suit for your bar mitzvah, if you need literally, if you need a dehumidifier, if you need a coffee pot, there's a separate little store for all of these things. But all the things are free. So they've been donated. And so you can live as a very poor person on the generosity of your fellow religious Jews. It's a remarkable place.
Yeah. So I guess I had so many questions when I read the piece. One of them was, it kind of brought me back to this moment in American politics when we were talking about faith-based initiatives, and President Bush was making the case that, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations are able to do charity in a way that the government can't. And it kind of plays into this larger conservative critique of the welfare state as this impersonal, sometimes destructive thing. And if only we could do this in a community-based way. We don't want no one to do this. We just don't want the government to do it. And I thought of all this when I was reading the piece, partly because of that part about having to set up the office to license begging or to permit begging, because it kind of brought home the idea that it was almost like, oh, wow, they're facing the same problems that a welfare bureaucracy would face almost, or like they're converging on the same kinds of issues and solutions. But also because I just wondered, not having gotten to travel with the community like you, you describe it as a wonderful place. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, I don't know. It doesn't seem scalable in any way. I'm not asking if we should try and export this model, but like, apart from it not being scalable, is it better? Is it like, is this a better way to take care of people who are needy? Is the contact that people have something that enriches their lives, or is it maddening, or is it hard to tease that out? Like, what was your impression?
Conor, those are really profound questions. I don't mean that as sort of I don't mean to praise you with condescension.
No, I know that. Yeah, how do you answer them?
Those are really deep questions. Let me say a few things. First of all, as I do try to make clear toward the end of the piece, the price you pay for this is everyone knowing that you're poor. Even though they try to respect people's dignity, and within the town itself, especially, you can get pretty much everything you need without anyone seeing you do it. I mean, people will deliver free food to your door late at night they will actually, one of the places that delivers food for you, they tell their volunteers who are, everyone wears a black coat or whatever, in sort of Orthodox garb. Mm-hmm. They change into the garb of like laborers, of, the guy who fills your oil tank or changes your septic tank, so that when the truck pulls up to give you food, the neighbors will think that it's some other service being performed. I mean, that's how serious they are about respecting people's dignity. That said, you don't have to scratch very far before everyone knows who's poor and who doesn't, because even these charities will call your rabbi or the teacher at your children's school to say, is this family really needy? Because they have to, because otherwise there's a free rider problem. So for one, this is, as anyone knows who's ever grown up in a really small town, in a tight-knit town, a small tight-knit community, the great thing is the warmth and the caring, and the terrible thing is everyone's in your business.
Right. Yeah.
So this reinscribes all of those things. There's no difference. That's exactly what's going on. Mm-hmm. The more profound question, which gets to sort of the 1,000 Points of Light, George Bush era, well, 1,000 Points of Light was his dad, but the faith-based initiative was W. Is, do you want to organize a society in these sort of small, insular, gnomic, micro communities that take care of each other? Right. The Mormons do a very good job of taking care of each other. The Orthodox Jews often do a good job of taking care of each other. On the other hand, like, we are a big pluralist, polyglot society in which we can't expect that every person will attach to one of these communities.
Right.
And what's more, some people get kicked out of these communities. And then what do you do if you don't have a safety net? What's more, many of these people in the communities are on welfare or are getting housing vouchers or getting food stamps. So it's not like these communities. I mean, Orthodox Jews do not eschew government help when necessary.
Right. This hasn't replaced the model. It has been an add-on.
It's an add-on. Yeah. But the last thing I'll say about this is it raises a really profound question for me as a religion writer, which is that there is this kind of direct correlation between level of religiosity and level of care. And so you will see ultra-Orthodox communities or religious Mormon communities taking care of their own, right? They're very devout and they're very good at taking care of their own in terms of just, charity, outreach, giving people food, visiting people in the hospital. You tend not to see that as much when you look at liberal religious communities, or less devout, or, places with less, I'm trying to remember the sociologist Rodney Stark's word. He talks about high tension communities, places where a lot of sacrifice is expected of you and a lot is demanded. And they are very good, but, this is not something that Unitarians or Reformed Jews or Congregationalists or liberal Episcopalians have ever been able to replicate. Mm-hmm. And so, now why is that? That seems to be something in the nature of human belonging and in sort of the sociology of small groups, which is the places where the rules are very, very strict and the in-group requirements are very, very strong, are also the places where they take care of each other more. So I don't think you can organize America on those principles.
Yeah, I also always wonder if part of the reason why Orthodox religious groups are able to do these things is having a much higher proportion of women who are out of the labor market. Do you think that this plays into it? Well,
in some religious communities, in Orthodox Jewish religious communities, women work all the time because the ideal is for the husband to be studying and not working.
Okay, so work in the labor market.
Lakewood actually has many, many unemployed men whose wives work very, very hard in the labor market.
Interesting.
But that said, your question is still pertinent. I mean, yes, that's what's going on in some places, is where marriage is still strong and where there's still a lot of stay-at-home women. This is their domain. This is what they do. Yeah. Right. On the other hand, in communities where people have, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 10 or 12 children, they all have less time than the rest of us do. Yeah. So if they, these stay-at-home mothers still have way more to do than, with in terms of their kids and putting food on the table. The fact that they still make time to take care of others in the community is still, a little embarrassing for the rest of us.
Right. Yeah. Well, I encourage everyone to go read it at the New York Times. It'll be on the sidebar along with other links that we've talked about today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's do this.
I encourage people to read your pieces, especially the one about John Stewart potentially as a replacement for Chuck Todd.
Yeah, and let's go out and see the Snowden movie, and we'll do this again sometime after you have done so.
It's a deal.
All right.